I just present you Richard Youngs. He's a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance program at Carnegie Europe. He works on EU foreign policy and on issues of international democracy. Richard is also professor of international relations at the University of Warwick. And prior to joining Carnegie, he was director of the European think tank Friede in Madrid. He has held positions in the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and he was a EU Marie Curie Fellow. And he was also senior fellow at the Transatlantic Academy in Washington. So he has published really widely, among 15 books, and more recently, Rebuilding European Democracy. And there's an older one, just some years older. It's Europe's Eastern Crisis, the Geopolitics of Asymmetry. And I think this is really, again, coming up and very timely again. So, dear Richard, please go ahead and tell us something about enlargement of the European Union.
Hi. Well, good morning to everyone. Thanks for the invitation, Michelle. I know I'm fitting into a wide-ranging series of seminars here, and you've addressed lots and lots of issues. So Michelle asked me just to talk about one very, very specific area of work, which is the enlargement debate, which myself and several colleagues in Carnegie have begun to look at. For me, I think the starting point, the interesting starting point, is that a few months ago, before the Ukraine invasion, the enlargement debate here in Brussels, where I'm sitting at the policy level, was almost running out of steam. And one of the spillover effects of the Ukraine invasion is that it's completely reawoken the whole debate about enlargement, accession. I'm sure you've all been debating this. You know that Ukraine put in a formal application for to be granted candidate status. Then Moldova and Georgia kind of jumped on the back of that. This is a big debate now. This is a big debate in Brussels. We're approaching a crunch moment. The European Commission is due to give its opinions on these applications next week, 15th of June, and then there'll be the summit at which governments, member states, are due to give their response, and the three countries are hoping, probably even assuming, that at that stage they will be definitively granted or firmly granted candidate status. So there's lots of levels of debate about European foreign policy and enlargement that spin off from this reawoken debate that we can go through in the discussion. I'll just for 10 minutes put some of the issues on the table that I think are interesting. At the moment, everything is up in the air. It's really not certain exactly what will happen. The general feeling is politically, member states can't really say no, especially to Ukraine. It's be difficult for them to say no to Moldova. Georgia's a slightly different case to do with political developments in that country. But certainly with respect to Ukraine, the general feeling is that there are still many member states that are skeptical or at least unenthusiastic about granting candidate status, but it will be almost impossible politically now for them to categorically reject the application processes. So the debate really is at a second order in terms of what kind of political signal the EU is likely to give the three countries, whether it will be unequivocal enough to actually move into a situation where formal negotiations start to bring the three countries into the EU, and particularly important, how fast the negotiations will actually move after this key summit in June, and how the accession process relates to events on the ground, the fact that Ukraine is still in war. All that is extremely important from a policy point of view. It also invites many analytical or academic questions. I'm sure Michelle's talked to you about this, that there's a whole generation of work being done on enlargement that I think now will come back to the surface, because one of the big debates here at the policy level in Brussels is that the issue is not just whether the EU grants candidate status to Ukraine, but the fact that if it does, the whole accession process will need to be reinvented. That we all know for the last 20 years, the accession process as it currently stands has not really worked. It hasn't worked with Turkey. It hasn't worked in the Balkans. And that it would be of little practical use to Ukraine simply to offer Ukraine candidate status, and then for there to be a period of kind of 10, 15, 20 years where Ukraine gets locked into this rather heavy bureaucratic process of the pre-accession preparations, but nothing really happens of tangible benefit to Ukraine or to Moldova and Georgia. So it's very, very interesting. The invasion has focused debate, as you all know, mainly on the defense side, the security side, what it's done in terms of breeding unity between member states, particularly on the need to beef up the defense side of European cooperation. But you can see it having this spillover effect in a more indirect way into all these other areas of EU policy. I mean, we could talk here about climate, energy, democracy, human rights policy, lots and lots of issues. But one of those issues that has come back to the surface because of the invasion is accession and the whole way that the EU approaches accession. So that would be my kind of main focus or perspective that I would put on the table that we can discuss. To start the debate some years ago, it's important to remember that this is not an entirely new issue, that Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova have been expressing their interest in joining the EU for over a decade, and the EU has basically been rebuffing them. It's been saying no. It's been offering lots and lots of cooperation, a cooperation that has helped the three states become more resilient in an institutional sense. Many people in Ukraine say that although Ukrainians for a whole decade were extremely disappointed and bitter about the fact that the EU would not let them in as full members, a lot of what the EU has been doing through very, very high levels of funding and political and strategic support over the last decade has helped Ukraine in its moment of crisis. It's helped Ukraine, civil society in particular, be more resilient and respond to the challenges of the invasion. So the huge amounts of money that the EU has poured into Ukraine over the last decade, one could say have had some utility in this moment of crisis. Nevertheless, there has been a feeling from the three applicant states, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, that the Eastern Partnership framework has gradually been running out of steam. That the Eastern Partnership objective of building regional cooperation between the 6 Eastern Partnership states has floundered. You know, the three applicant countries have more or less detached themselves from Armenia, Belarus, and Azerbaijan, that have a lower level of ambition in terms of their cooperation with the European Union. And even before the invasion started in February, they were pushing to be granted applicant status and to basically detach themselves from the Eastern Partnership with the argument that the cooperation offered for a decade under the Eastern Partnership was useful, but it was really reaching its limit, and that these three countries were already looking for ways for developing their cooperation in a deeper and more systematic way. I think conceptually, academically, the basic way that the EU has approached this issue for the last decade is to reject both a fully cooperative approach to security and to reject a sphere of influence argument. What do I mean by that? It's if you look at the realist argument, this for a decade has been making the argument that the EU basically should not get involved. It should not get involved in the Eastern area. This is to get involved, to make promises that the EU then cannot fulfill, cannot follow through, is actually counterproductive from a geopolitical point of view. That if the EU were to step back and not engage quite so systematically, this would actually remove all the reasons that Russia has for intervening in a damaging way, in a prejudicial way in the region. The more liberal argument says that the way the EU should have dealt with this strategic challenge in the Eastern Partnership was simply to get the countries into the EU as quickly as possible, fully integrate them, fully take responsibility for their security. So to my mind, the EU's rejected both of those arguments, and it's left the region in a kind of halfway house, a halfway situation between those two different analytical ways of understanding EU strategic interests. So the EU's basically said it would support the three countries in quite far-reaching ways. It rejects the Russian argument that these are parts of the Russian sphere of influence. But on the other hand, neither is the EU moved in to integrate the three countries in a way that would make them part of a single security community or single political space. It looked for a while as if this middle way strategic logic might even be working. Russia stopped advancing. The crisis in Ukraine was almost held in abeyance. The crises across the Eastern region didn't seem to be gathering in quite such a serious way as many people thought might be the case after Crimea's annexation in 2013, 2014. But it always seemed to be the case. It always seemed to be the case to many observers that for all these years, the EU's basic approach was basically containing the problems rather than resolving them in any firm or systematic way. So perhaps you've talked with Michelle about this conceptual academic difference between conflict containment and conflict resolution. To my mind, EU policy accorded much more with the former, this approach of rather superficial conflict containment rather than devising policies capable in any ways of getting to the dealing with the drivers, the root causes of the strategic uncertainties and unpredictability across the Eastern European region. So I think it was almost certain that at some point the conflict would come back and that the EU would have to grapple with the very difficult questions that are now on the table. Of course, nobody really suspected they would come back in such a tragic and direct and brutal fashion. But if you kind of step back from the very difficult day-to-day policy challenges the EU is dealing with now at a deeper conceptual level, I think you can see the basic core challenge is whether the EU is willing fundamentally to change this kind of low-cost security approach it's had towards the Eastern region for 10, 15 years. If it is not, then I think the conflict and all the troubles associated with it will continue, will persist, and they will have very, very difficult strategic spillover effects on the European Union. That it's right now, I mean, literally within the next few days, that the EU has to decide whether it's capable of going on to the next level and saying the invasion fundamentally changes the way we conceptualize the EU's whole approach towards security and strategic interest in the Middle East. You will all have seen that the High Representative, European leaders have been making a lot of speeches since the invasion started, saying this is a game changer. The invasion gives birth to a geopolitical Europe, that nothing is the same in the shadow of the invasion. The EU now is fully securitizing its whole approach. I think that is a possibility. There are some signs of this fundamental shift in thinking, but it's not clear yet that member states are willing fully to make this transformation to a different way of dealing with these security challenges in the East. I think we still see a lot of continuity. I'm not convinced we are really seeing yet the full birth of a geopolitical Europe. I think the whole terminology of a geopolitical Europe is conceptually problematic. And so I think that we are likely to see a policy of more political support to Ukraine, but at the same time, member states trying to avoid making this definitive decision on actually bringing Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova into the European Union. There are still member states, despite what's happened with the invasion, who are making the argument here that enlargement could be provocative to Russia and strategically damaging to the EU. That's the argument they've been making for a decade. Strategically, it seems to me that logic didn't work because Russia has intervened anyway. So this logic of strategic caution, I think, is rather more questionable today than it was before the invasion. There is still an argument being made that however much the EU wants to support Ukraine politically, it just can't afford financially to bring Ukraine into the EU, that domestic populations will not accept the sacrifices they would have to make to extend existing EU policies to Ukraine. Again, this is somewhat questionable, or it's something we can debate, because if you look at all the opinion polls, they suggest that publics are now much more enthusiastic about bringing Ukraine in than governments are. So it seems now as if public opinion is somewhat ahead of European governments. Still, I think that if Ukraine were to be granted candidate status, there would be difficult debates ahead. It's not going to be a magical solution, a panacea for helping Ukraine with reconstruction, with building the resilience of its institutions. Undoubtedly, even the governments, the member states keenest at the moment on bringing Ukraine into the European Union will fight hard to retain their own financial privileges in the European Union. And as you all know, when we get down to talking about money in accession processes, that's when a lot of the differences and the delays then occur. So there's still a lot of there would still be a lot of difficult politics involved in bringing the three countries into the European Union, even if this argument that the public doesn't want more enlargement, I don't think now is so legitimate, given the way that the European public has responded to Ukraine's plight. Following on from this, it seems to me that conceptually, and this might be one thing you've been debating on the course, what the Ukraine invasion does and the enlargement, the reawakening of the enlargement debate does, is put on the table these very difficult interrelationships between the EU's external agenda and its internal reforms. You all know the Conference on the Future of Europe has just finished. Exactly what governments will do with the recommendations remains to be seen. But it does seem clear that if the EU were to change its strategic approach towards the Eastern Partnership, accept the three countries as candidates, do something tangible to actually speed up their incorporation into the European Union, this would involve a whole series of difficult internal reforms as well. The EU would have to look at the whole structure of its internal reforms, its voting procedures, because of one really, really vital issue, and that is the experience of Hungary and Poland. I can't underestimate to you how, at the policy level here in Brussels, how much of a worry this is in causing many member states to be less enthusiastic about Ukraine's membership than they otherwise would be. The fear is that in 5-10 years' time, Ukraine could be another Hungary, another Poland, if political trends go in the wrong direction in these countries. The fear is that they could basically stop the whole machinery of the EU working, more or less in some areas at least, as Hungary and Poland have done. You all know the EU did not set itself up institutionally to deal with democratic backsliding problems of countries once they had joined the European Union. The EU has many excellent tools of conditionality to deal with democracy and human rights problems before candidates actually join the EU, but the EU had not thought that it would need to follow through or to have such instruments available once countries joined the European Union. Now the fear is that countries like Georgia, Moldova might bring in these kinds of governance problems to the European Union. So suffice to say, I think today if the three countries do get candidate status as they want, it will open up a whole Pandora's box of internal reforms as well. And then, if I may, Michelle, I see I've almost used up my time, but I'm just trying to put a few kind of conceptual issues on the table for us to debate. So one is to do with the EU's whole way of defining its strategic interests. Another is to do with developments and conflict, the conflict dynamics on the ground itself. Another one is to do with the whole internal reform agenda and how this accession will affect the whole nature of the EU itself. And then a final one I would put on the table is this, that the accession process itself would, I think, need to change if it is to demonstrate itself of being of concrete, tangible benefit to Ukraine over the next few years. Even if member states give Ukraine a positive answer in the summit in a couple of weeks' time, I think the question will remain over how the accession process can actually help Ukraine preserve its basic sovereignty. The accession process as it currently stands was not really designed to do this. It was designed to lock in governance reforms, economic reforms, political democratic commitments once governments had already got to a certain stage of institutional development. It seems to me that the situation we would be facing in Ukraine is sui generis, it's completely different. And we are talking about a country that may not even be able to operate fully in an institutional sense over its entire territory. I don't think Ukraine is going to benefit very much from lots of very, very technical negotiations over food labeling, standards, safety, environmental conditions, and so on and so forth, when it's actually fighting for its own survival. So for me, a big question is how the EU, how flexible, how adaptable the EU can be in terms of modifying its accession process to deal with the kinds of very existential political questions that Ukraine will bring to the table. It will require accession to be more of a framework, a vehicle for security support, for more direct political support. And this will require a more proactive approach to accession, I think, on the EU's part than the EU has shown in Turkey and in the Balkans. This is a very, very complex debate, but experts have been working on enlargement, I mean, Michelle among them, but others as well, for many, many years, make the criticism that in Turkey and the Balkans, the shortcoming on the EU side was that the EU made these big, grand commitments to enlargement, to bringing in the candidate states, but then didn't really follow through in a high-level political way. It left these processes almost to run along at a kind of technical level, and never really invested enough proactive political attention. And to the extent that eventually all the leverage that the enlargement could have over these countries' political processes simply evaporated. The countries judged that the EU was not going to follow through on its promises, and all the leverage and influence that enlargement should have given over these countries' internal reform process simply did not materialize. I think there's a very, very important lesson that the EU would have to learn in terms of how it needs to revise and rethink its approach to enlargement if accession, the candidate status offer, is likely to be relevant to Ukraine. And that has opened up a whole debate here about a so-called staged process of accession, making sure that accession happens in stages rather than opening negotiations and then nothing much happening for 20 years. And the candidate countries having to incorporate all the EU legislation onto their own books before they actually get the benefits of EU membership, rather rethinking things so that as and when they are ready to join particular sectors of European cooperation, they are given the rights, the full rights of members in those particular sectors, so that they get some kind of concrete benefit from this process in the short to medium term. That's the thinking, that's the debate. Can we have a more staged or incremental process of enlargement? Many people support this. It's going to be very, very difficult to make this work in practice. And I think there, but academically and at policy level, is where we need a lot of good rethinking and fresh ideas of how this whole process about accession can actually be relevant to the crisis situation that Ukraine is in at the moment.
So thank you so much, Richard. That was so fantastic. And I think we learned a lot. Thanks a lot. And good luck in your day-to-day policy work in Brussels.
Okay, thanks everyone. See you soon, Michelle.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.